The year was 1487, in the forgotten valleys of Millbrook County, a time when a man's worth was measured by the land he owned and the loyalty he commanded. Thomas Harrow stood alone against forces that would crush most men. When Lord Richard Crawford's knights surrounded his modest farm at dawn, no one expected what happened next, a simple farmer's defiance that would change the course of an entire kingdom. This is the story of courage in the face of overwhelming power, of one man's refusal to surrender what was rightfully his, and the unexpected alliance that would defy the laws of both nature and nobility. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It all started on a misty autumn morning in the fertile valley of Millbrook. The golden wheat fields swayed gently in the breeze as Thomas Harrow's calloused hands worked the soil that had been in his family for 3 generations. At 42, the lines etched into his weathered face told stories of drought, harsh winters, and the back-breaking labor that came with tending 20 acres of the most productive farmland in the county. His chestnut hair, now streaked with grey, was damp with morning dew as he straightened his aching back and surveyed his domain with quiet pride. The Harrow farm wasn't grand by any measure, but it was Thomas's entire world. The modest wooden farmhouse with its smoking chimney, the barn where his 2 horses and 6 cows resided, the chicken coop, and most importantly, the vast expanse of wheat and cornfields that fed not only his family but half the nearby village of Oakridge. His wife Sarah had passed 5 winters ago from fever, leaving him to raise their son Matthew, now 15, alone. The boy was currently mending a fence on the eastern edge of their property, his lanky frame showing signs of the strong man he would soon become. "Pa, riders coming!" Matthew's voice carried across the field, breaking Thomas's moment of contemplation. Thomas squinted against the morning sun. 3 figures on horseback approached from the main road, their fine clothes and the glint of polished metal marking them as nobility or their representatives. His stomach tightened. Nobles rarely brought good news to common folk. At their lead rode Jackson Miller, Lord Crawford's steward, a thin, calculating man with eyes that seemed to be constantly assessing the value of everything they beheld. Flanking him were 2 of Crawford's personal guards, their crimson cloaks bearing the silver hawk insignia of the Crawford estate. "Master Harrow," Miller called out, not bothering to dismount, a deliberate slight that wasn't lost on Thomas. "I come bearing a generous offer from Lord Richard Crawford." Thomas wiped his hands on his worn trousers and stood his ground. "I'm listening." "Lord Crawford has taken notice of your modest holding." Miller's lips curled into what might generously be called a smile. "He wishes to expand his hunting grounds and has deemed this valley suitable. He offers you 60 silver pieces for your land, a most generous sum that would allow you to relocate comfortably." Thomas felt his heart pound against his ribs. 60 silver pieces was indeed a substantial amount for a farmer, enough to purchase a small home in town and perhaps open a shop. But the land beneath his feet was worth far more than silver could measure. "This land isn't for sale," Thomas replied, his voice steady despite the rage building within him. "Please, convey my gratitude to Lord Crawford for his offer. But my answer is no." Miller's false smile vanished. "You misunderstand, Harrow. This isn't a negotiation. Lord Crawford has decided this valley will join his estate. The offer is merely a courtesy." By now Matthew had approached, standing slightly behind his father, tension evident in his young shoulders. "Then Lord Crawford misunderstands," Thomas replied, standing taller. "This land was granted to my grandfather by King Edward himself, for service in the northern campaigns. I have the royal charter in my home. This farm is legally mine, and I have no intention of selling, not for 60 silver pieces, not for 600. Miller's face hardened. "Legal documents can be reinterpreted. Lord Crawford has the ear of the current regent. Consider carefully the consequences of defying a man of his influence." "My answer remains no," Thomas said, crossing his arms. "Now, unless you've come to purchase wheat, I have work to return to." Miller's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You have until sunset tomorrow to reconsider. After that, Lord Crawford will pursue other methods to acquire what he desires." With that, he jerked his reins, turning his horse sharply. "Come dawn, you'll wish you had taken the silver," he called over his shoulder as the three riders departed. Matthew moved to his father's side. "What will we do, Pa?" Thomas watched the dust rising from the retreating horses' hooves. "We'll do what Harrows have always done, son. We'll stand our ground." That evening, as shadows lengthened across the valley, Thomas sat at his worn oak table, reviewing the royal charter that proved his ownership. The yellowed parchment, carefully preserved in oilcloth, clearly stated that the land was granted in perpetuity to the Harrow lineage. Legally, not even Lord Crawford could seize it without cause. But Thomas wasn't naive. Law was one thing, power was another. Lord Richard Crawford controlled nearly everything in Millbrook County: the mill, the bridges, the markets, and most importantly, the local magistrate. If Crawford wanted something badly enough, he usually found a way to obtain it. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Thomas carefully rewrapped the charter and tucked it inside his shirt before answering. On his doorstep stood Eleanor Davis, the village healer and midwife, a widow close to Thomas's age, whose knowledge of herbs and remedies was respected throughout the county. Her auburn hair was tied back in a practical braid, and her green eyes held concern. "I heard about Crawford's men visiting," she said without preamble. "The whole village is talking." Thomas sighed and gestured for her to enter. "Word travels fast. Is it true you refuse to sell?" Eleanor asked, accepting the cup of cider Thomas offered. "It's true," he confirmed. "This land isn't just soil and crops, Eleanor. It's my family's legacy. My grandfather cleared it with his own hands. My father improved it. I was born here, married Sarah here, and buried her beneath the old oak on the North Hill. How could I sell that for any price?" Eleanor nodded, understanding in her eyes. She and Thomas had a friendship that had deepened since Sarah's passing, both finding solace in shared experiences of loss and resilience. "Crawford isn't known for accepting refusal gracefully," she warned. "I know," Thomas replied grimly, "but I have the royal charter. By law, the land is mine." Eleanor's laugh held no humor. "When has law ever stopped men like Crawford? He has 30 knights and twice as many men-at-arms. What do you have, a pitchfork and your boy?" The truth of her words stung, but Thomas's resolution didn't waver. "I have what's right on my side." "Right doesn't stop a sword," Eleanor countered, but her voice softened, seeing his determination. "At least let me help. I know people, not just in the village. There's a group in the western woods, displaced farmers and craftsmen who've suffered under Crawford's rule. They might stand with you." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Outlaws." "Freemen," Eleanor corrected, "led by a former knight named James Blackwood. He served the old king before Crawford had him stripped of his lands on false charges of treason. He helps those whom Crawford has wronged." Thomas considered this. He'd heard whispers of Blackwood's band, but had always kept his distance from anything that might bring trouble to his doorstep. Now trouble had found him anyway. "I won't bring violence to my land," he said finally. "Sometimes we don't choose violence, Thomas. Sometimes it chooses us." Eleanor stood and moved toward the door. "Think on it. If you change your mind, leave a red cloth on your fence post. I'll make sure Blackwood gets word." After she left, Thomas stared into the crackling fire, his mind heavy with decisions that would shape not just his future, but Matthew's as well. The boy had said little during dinner, but his eyes reflected his fear and his pride in his father's stance. Later that night, as Matthew slept, Thomas crept out to the fence post at the edge of his property. After a moment's hesitation, he tied a strip of red cloth to the weathered wood. Then he returned to his home, checked that his old sword, another relic of his grandfather's military days, was sharp enough, and tried to sleep, despite knowing what morning might bring. In the dense forest 5 miles west, Eleanor Davis moved silently between ancient trees, guided by the light of a nearly full moon. At a particular lightning-struck oak, she whistled a pattern. 3 short notes. 1 long. From the shadows, a tall figure emerged. "The Harrow Farm," she said without greeting. "Crawford wants it. Thomas Harrow refused to sell." James Blackwood's scarred face remained impassive, but interest flickered in his dark eyes. "And?" "Thomas has the royal charter. The land is legally his." "Law," Blackwood scoffed. "What good did the king's law do for me or for any of us?" "That's why I'm here," Eleanor persisted. "Thomas Harrow is a good man. If Crawford takes his land, half the village will go hungry next winter. The Harrow Farm produces more wheat than any other in the valley." Blackwood considered this. "Does Harrow seek our help?" "He's considering it. Look for a red cloth on his fence post." Eleanor met Blackwood's skeptical gaze steadily. "Not everyone can fight as you do, James, but everyone deserves the chance to keep what's rightfully theirs." Blackwood nodded slowly. "If he signals, we'll watch over the farm. Beyond that, I make no promises." As Eleanor left, Blackwood stared up at the moon. Another confrontation with Crawford was inevitable. He only hoped this farmer had the courage to stand his ground when morning came. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dawn broke with an eerie silence across the Harrow Farm. Thomas had barely slept, rising well before first light to prepare for whatever the day might bring. He'd spent the early hours moving his most valuable livestock to the far pasture, hidden by a small copse of trees, and gathering what weapons he had: his grandfather's sword, a hunting bow, and several tools that could serve as makeshift weapons if needed. Matthew worked alongside him, solemn and quiet, understanding the gravity of their situation without needing it explained. The boy had grown up overnight, Thomas thought, with a mixture of pride and sadness. "Should we flee, Pa?" Matthew finally asked as they carried buckets of water from the well to the house. "We could go to Uncle William's place in Westford." Thomas shook his head. "Running means we've already lost. And if we leave, Crawford will have this land by nightfall, charter or no. Then we fight." Matthew's voice held a tremor, but his jaw was set with determination. "We stand," Thomas corrected. "There's a difference." The sun had just cleared the eastern hills, bathing the wheat fields in golden light when they heard it. The distinctive sound of many horses approaching from the main road. Thomas and Matthew climbed onto the roof of the barn for a better view, and what they saw stole the breath from their lungs. At least 20 mounted knights in polished armor lined the ridge overlooking the farm, their crimson cloaks billowing in the morning breeze. Behind them stood another 30 men-at-arms bearing spears and crossbows. At their center, seated on a magnificent black stallion, was Lord Richard Crawford himself, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a greying beard, and cold eyes that surveyed the Harrow Farm with naked greed. "That's more than just a warning party," Thomas murmured, his mouth suddenly dry. "What do we do?" Matthew whispered, fear evident in his young voice. Before Thomas could answer, movement at the farm's edge caught his attention. Riders were approaching. From the west, not Crawford's men, but a group of roughly dressed individuals led by a tall figure on a dappled grey horse. As they drew closer, Thomas recognized the scarred face of James Blackwood, former knight and now leader of the forest. "Outlaws!" "Eleanor's message got through," Thomas said, relief washing over him. But it was short-lived, as he counted only 15 riders with Blackwood, brave, certainly, but badly outnumbered by Crawford's forces. Blackwood and his band halted at the edge of the wheat field, deliberately positioning themselves between Crawford's men and the farmhouse. A statement of intention that wasn't lost on anyone present. Lord Crawford's booming voice carried across the morning air. "Thomas Harrow! I see you've enlisted the help of traitors and thieves. This only confirms your own criminal nature." Thomas climbed down from the barn roof, motioning for Matthew to remain hidden. He walked toward the center of his land, stopping between the two opposing forces. From this position, he had to crane his neck to look up at Crawford on the ridge, but he refused to appear intimidated. "I've broken no law, Lord Crawford," he called back. "This land was granted to my family by royal charter. I declined your offer to purchase it, as is my right as a free man." Crawford's laugh was harsh. "Rights? You speak of rights. I am the law in Millbrook County. The magistrate has already ruled this land was obtained through fraudulent means by your grandfather. The charter is invalid." "That's a lie," Thomas shouted, anger finally breaking through his calm facade. "My grandfather served King Edward faithfully for 15 years. This land was his reward." "Mind your tongue, peasant," Crawford snarled. "I've come with a final offer, 40 silver pieces, and you may leave with your possessions and that boy of yours. Refuse, and you leave with nothing, if you leave at all." James Blackwood urged his horse forward, coming to stop beside Thomas. Up close, the former knight was an imposing figure, well over 6 feet tall, with dark hair streaked with grey and eyes that had seen too much bloodshed. "Your father would be ashamed, Richard," Blackwood called up to Crawford. "Old Lord William." Crawford was a hard man, but a just one. He respected the king's charters. Crawford's face darkened with rage. "You dare speak my father's name, traitor? You, who conspired against the crown?" "We both know those charges were false," Blackwood replied evenly, "just as we know this charter is valid. You simply want this fertile valley for your hunting grounds while good people starve." The standoff stretched into tense silence. Crawford's knights shifted restlessly, hands on sword hilts. Behind them, the crossbowmen waited for the command to raise their weapons. "I have 30 armed men who say this land is mine," Crawford finally said, his voice dangerously soft. "How many do you have, farmer?" Before Thomas could respond, a new voice joined the confrontation. "He has the village." Eleanor Davis emerged from the direction of the farmhouse, and behind her came a stream of villagers, bakers, blacksmiths, coopers, and farmers, nearly 40 in all, armed with whatever implements they could find. Thomas stared in disbelief. Among them, he recognized Mason the blacksmith, bearing his heaviest hammer, old Jenkins with his butcher's cleaver, Sarah Williams and her 3 grown sons carrying scythes, and dozens more from Oakridge Village. People who had bought his wheat, shared meals at his table, danced at harvest festivals with his family. Eleanor moved to stand on Thomas's other side. "The Harrow farm feeds half the county, Lord Crawford. Take it, and people starve. These villagers have come to testify that the charter is genuine, and to stand with its rightful owner." Crawford's expression was thunderous as he assessed the gathered villagers. While they were poorly armed compared to his knights, the numbers were now more evenly matched. Moreover, attacking common folk who were simply supporting a legitimate charter would be difficult to justify to the regent, whose support Crawford needed for other endeavors. "This isn't over," Crawford growled. "Clear this rabble from my sight. We'll continue this discussion another day." He wheeled his horse around, preparing to depart. "There's nothing to discuss," Thomas called after him. "This land isn't for sale. Not today, not tomorrow." Crawford paused, looking back over his shoulder. "We'll see how brave you are when your crops mysteriously fail, when no miller will grind your grain, when your well runs dry. There are many ways to fight, Harrow." With that ominous promise, he signaled his men, and the entire company departed, leaving only a cloud of dust in their wake. A cheer went up from the villagers, but Thomas didn't join in. He knew this wasn't a victory, merely a postponement. of the inevitable confrontation. Blackwood dismounted and approached Thomas, offering his hand. "Your stand today was brave and foolish." Thomas clasped the offered hand. "I'm simply protecting what's mine." Crawford doesn't forget, and he doesn't forgive, Blackwood warned. "He'll be back with different tactics." "Then I'll face those too," Thomas replied. "Thank you for coming. You didn't have to risk yourselves." Eleanor joined them, her expression grim despite the apparent victory. "We came because if Crawford can take your land, none of us are safe. Today showed him we're stronger together than apart." The villagers began to disperse, returning to their daily routines, each stopping to offer Thomas a word of support or a firm handshake. Matthew emerged from his hiding place, relief evident on his young face as he rushed to his father's side. As the crowd thinned, only Blackwood's band, Eleanor, Thomas and Matthew, remained in the center of the wheat field. Crawford mentioned, "Crops failing and wells running dry," Thomas said quietly. "What did he mean?" "He has men skilled in subtle sabotage," Blackwood explained. "They might salt your fields at night, poison your well, or set fire to your barn when you're not watching. His preferred method is to make life so unbearable that selling becomes the easier choice." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Then I'll need eyes, watching day and night." "My people can help with that," Blackwood offered. "We'll set up watches in rotation." Eleanor nodded. "The village will contribute too. Crawford may control the county, but he doesn't own our loyalty." As they discussed plans for protecting the farm, none of them noticed the lone figure watching from the distant tree line. Jackson Miller, Lord Crawford's steward, observing every interaction, noting every face before slipping away to report, back to his master. That evening, Thomas sat at his table with Eleanor, Blackwood and Matthew, mapping out a strategy for the days ahead. The kitchen was warm from the cooking fire, the simple meal of bread and stew a stark contrast to the weightiness of their conversation. "Crawford will try to isolate you first," Blackwood explained, tracing lines on a rough map of the county. "Cut off your ability to sell your grain, block roads to your farm, perhaps even impose a special tax on those who do business with you." "Can he do that?" Matthew asked, his young face creased with worry. "Legally? No. But practically?" Blackwood shrugged. "He controls the roads, the bridges, the markets." Eleanor tapped the map thoughtfully. "We need allies beyond just Oakridge. The Regent should know what's happening here." "The Regent is 3 days' hard ride away," Thomas pointed out, "and he's known to be in Crawford's pocket." Blackwood leaned forward, his scarred face intense in the firelight. "Not in his pocket, in his debt. There's a difference. If we could get proof of Crawford's intimidation tactics, the Regent might side with us simply to distance himself from the scandal." "Proof?" Thomas looked skeptical. "What kind of proof would convince a regent to turn against a powerful lord?" A slow smile spread across Blackwood's face. "I think it's time you learned why Crawford really wants your land, Thomas. It's not for hunting grounds." He pulled a folded parchment from inside his tunic. "One of my men intercepted this message last month. It seems there's something valuable buried beneath these fields, something worth far more than wheat." The parchment Blackwood spread on the table was a map, not of the county as it currently existed, but as it had been nearly a century earlier. Faded ink marked old boundaries, forgotten paths, and structures long since returned to dust. A red circle highlighted an area that encompassed most of Thomas's farm. "This is a survey commissioned by King Henry II before the Great Plague," Blackwood explained, his finger tracing the parchment's yellowed edge. "Notice anything unusual about your land?" Thomas leaned closer, studying the marked area. Where his farm now stood, the map showed a different name, Silverstone Priory. He'd never heard of such a place. "There was a monastery here?" he asked, confusion evident in his voice. Eleanor nodded, her expression solemn. "Before your grandfather's time, it was destroyed during the religious purges. Most records of it were burned or hidden. What does an old monastery have to do with Crawford wanting my land? Thomas asked, though a suspicion was already forming in his mind. Blackwood tapped the red circle. 3 months ago, Crawford hired foreign scholars to examine old church records. They were researching something specific, the lost treasury of Silverstone Priory. Matthew's eyes widened. Treasure under our farm. Not gold or jewels, Blackwood clarified. Something potentially more valuable. The Silverstone monks were renowned healers. They cultivated rare medicinal herbs and developed treatments for diseases that baffled other physicians. Their most guarded secret was a formula they called vitae elixir, said to cure even the most virulent plague. Eleanor leaned forward. As a healer, I've heard whispers of this elixir. Most consider it a myth, but if it were real, she shook her head in wonder, its value would be incalculable. The formula was supposedly hidden beneath the priory when the monks received warning of the coming purge, Blackwood continued. Crawford believes it's still there, preserved somehow, waiting to be discovered. Thomas sat back, processing this revelation. So Crawford doesn't want my land for hunting at all. He wants to tear it apart, searching for this formula. Precisely, Blackwood confirmed, and he's not the only one. The regent himself suffers from a wasting illness that has confounded the royal physicians. If Crawford finds a legendary cure, his influence would be limitless, Thomas finished, the full implications becoming clear. Matthew looked up from the map. But if this elixir really exists, couldn't it help people? Maybe we should look for it ourselves. An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. It was Eleanor who finally spoke, her voice gentle but firm. The elixir, if real, would indeed help many, but power like that in the wrong hands. She exchanged a meaningful look with Blackwood. And there's a reason the monks hid it, rather than let it fall into the possession of those who would use it for control, rather than healing. Thomas pushed back from the table, pacing the small kitchen. So what do we do? If Crawford is after this formula, he won't stop until he has my land. We have 2 advantages, Blackwood said, folding the map carefully. First, Crawford doesn't know we're aware of his true motives. Second, we know this land better than he ever could. If there is something hidden here, we have a better chance of finding it. You're suggesting we search for it ourselves? Thomas asked skeptically. I'm suggesting we determine if it exists at all, Blackwood clarified. And if it does, ensure it doesn't fall into Crawford's hands. Eleanor stood, gathering her shawl around her shoulders. I should return to the village. People will be watching for Crawford's retaliation. We need to be prepared. As she moved toward the door, Thomas followed. Thank you, Eleanor, for everything today. She paused, her green eyes meeting his. We take care of our own in Oak Ridge. You've fed us for years. Now we stand with you. She hesitated, then added more softly, Sarah would be proud of you today. The mention of his late wife sent a familiar ache through Thomas's chest, but he nodded gratefully. After Eleanor departed, he returned to find Blackwood and Matthew still poring over the map. If there was a monastery here, there might be foundations beneath the soil, Matthew was saying, excitement coloring his voice. Blackwood nodded. Possibly. The question is where to start looking. Thomas sat heavily in his chair. Even if we find something, what then? Crawford still wants my land, and he has the power to take it. That's why we need leverage, Blackwood replied, a calculating gleam in his eyes. Information we can use to keep Crawford at bay. What kind of information? Thomas asked warily. The kind that would ruin him if revealed. Blackwood leaned forward. Crawford has enemies beyond just us, people he's wronged, secrets he'd prefer kept hidden. My network extends further than he realizes. As night fell fully, Blackwood's men established a perimeter around the farm, taking positions in the barn, the fields, and the nearby woods. Thomas insisted Matthew get some rest, though the boy protested until exhaustion finally claimed him. Left alone, Thomas and Blackwood sat by the dying kitchen fire, speaking in low voices. "Your son has his mother's spirit," Blackwood observed. Sipping the last of Thomas's homemade cider, Thomas smiled faintly. "And her stubbornness. Sarah never backed down from anything she believed in." "A valuable trait," Blackwood commented. After a moment's hesitation, he asked, "What will you do if we can't stop Crawford?" Thomas stared into the embers. "I don't know. This land is everything to me. Not just soil and crops, but memories. Sarah is buried here. Our life together is in every corner of this farm." "I understand," Blackwood said quietly. "My own lands were more than just property. They were my identity, my purpose." "How did you bear losing them?" Thomas asked. Blackwood's scarred face hardened. "I didn't. Not. Really. I simply found a new purpose, ensuring Crawford pays for what he's taken from so many." Before Thomas could respond, a sharp whistle came from outside, 3 short notes, the signal they'd established for approaching danger. Both men were on their feet instantly, grabbing weapons and moving silently to the door. Outside, the night was clear, stars scattered across the sky like diamond dust. One of Blackwood's men, a burly former blacksmith named Harris, approached from the western field. "Riders," he reported tersely, "coming through the woods, moving quietly, no torches." "Crawford's men?" Thomas asked, straining to see in the darkness. "2. Soon for a direct attack," Blackwood mused. "More likely scouts or saboteurs." Harris nodded in agreement. 4 of them, lightly armed, heading toward the well. "The well," Thomas repeated, alarm sharpening his voice. He meant it literally, poisoning our water. "Get the others," Blackwood ordered Harris. "We'll intercept them before they reach it." Within minutes, 5 of Blackwood's men had gathered. Weapons ready, Thomas insisted on joining them, despite Blackwood's objections. "It's my farm, my well," he said firmly, gripping his grandfather's sword. "I'll defend it." They moved silently through the wheat field, keeping low. The moon, nearly full, cast enough light to see by without revealing their approach. As they neared the well, they spotted the intruders. 4 men in dark clothing, one carrying what appeared to be a small barrel. Blackwood signaled for his men to spread out, encircling the saboteurs. Thomas's heart hammered in his chest, but his hands remained steady on his sword. When the intruders were fully committed to their task, Blackwood gave the signal. "That water isn't yours to spoil," he called out, stepping from the shadows with his blade drawn. The saboteurs froze, then scrambled for their weapons. Thomas and the others closed in, cutting off escape routes. In the ensuing struggle, 3 of Crawford's men were quickly subdued, but the 4th, the one with the barrel, made a desperate break toward the woods. Thomas pursued, his knowledge of the terrain giving him an advantage even in darkness. He intercepted the fleeing man at the edge of the forest, tackling him to the ground. The barrel tumbled from the man's grasp, its contents spilling onto the soil, a noxious-smelling liquid that hissed as it soaked into the earth. "What is this?" Thomas demanded, pinning the struggling man. "What were you going to put in my well?" The man's next words chilled Thomas to the bone. "Lord Crawford sends his regards," he spat. "This is just the beginning. By harvest time, nothing will grow in your precious soil." Blackwood arrived at Thomas's side, roughly hauling the saboteur to his feet. "Take him to the barn with the others," he ordered one of his men. "We'll get answers before dawn." As they secured the prisoners, Thomas knelt beside the spilled barrel, careful not to touch the liquid that had already killed the grass where it had spilled. "He's escalating faster than I expected," Blackwood said grimly, crouching beside Thomas. "This wasn't just meant to inconvenience you. This substance could have poisoned your entire water supply." Thomas stood, his expression hardening. "Crawford's willing to poison innocent people to get what he wants." "Which means we need to move quickly," Blackwood replied. "If there is something hidden on your land, we need to find it before he takes more drastic measures." As they walked back toward the farmhouse, Thomas paused, looking up at the stars. "There's something I haven't told you," he said finally. "Something my father mentioned before he died. A stone chamber beneath the north field. I always thought it was just the foundation of an old storage cellar, but now—" Blackwood's eyes gleamed with interest. "Show me. First light tomorrow." Neither man noticed the shadowy figure slipping away through the trees, another of Crawford's spies who had observed the entire confrontation. By dawn, Crawford would know his saboteurs had failed, and what Thomas had revealed about the stone chamber beneath the north field. The first rays of dawn painted the eastern sky in hues of pink and gold as Thomas led Blackwood across the northern field. Matthew insisted on joining them, despite Thomas's concerns for his safety. The boy had proven himself brave during the night's events, helping to secure the captured saboteurs in the barn. "It's just beyond that rise," Thomas explained, pointing to a slight elevation in the otherwise flat terrain. "I haven't been inside since I was Matthew's age. My father forbade us from playing there, said it wasn't safe." As they crested the small hill, Thomas scanned the ground, searching for familiar markers that had likely been obscured by decades of farming. Finally, he stopped at a spot where the wheat grew slightly thinner than the surrounding crop. "Here," he said, kneeling to brush away soil from what appeared to be a large, flat stone. "Help me clear this." The three of them worked quickly, scraping away years of accumulated earth to reveal a stone slab approximately 4 feet square. Carved into its surface was a symbol, a circle crossed by a single vertical line. "The mark of Silverstone Priory," Blackwood murmured, tracing the weathered engraving with his fingertips. "This confirms it. We're standing on monastery grounds." Matthew looked around, wide-eyed. "Hard to imagine monks living here." "The priory would have been destroyed down to its foundations during the purge," Blackwood explained. "Most above-ground structures were dismantled, the stones repurposed for other buildings, but underground chambers often remained intact." "How do we move this?" Thomas asked, pushing against the stone slab to no avail. Blackwood examined the edges carefully. "There should be a mechanism. The monks wouldn't have sealed it permanently if they intended the formula to be retrieved someday." After several minutes of searching, Matthew noticed a small depression in the stone's surface, almost invisible beneath years of weathering. "What about this?" he asked, pointing to the faint indentation. Blackwood pressed his thumb into the depression and pushed. Nothing happened at first, but when he simultaneously applied pressure to the symbol's center, they heard a faint click. The stone shifted slightly. "Clever," Blackwood said appreciatively. "A double trigger mechanism." With renewed effort, the three of them managed to slide the stone slab partially aside, revealing a dark opening beneath. Cool, stale air wafted up from the chamber below. Thomas retrieved a torch they had brought, struck flint to steel, and lit it. The flame cast flickering shadows as he held it over the opening. "I'll go first," he said firmly, already lowering himself into the darkness. The chamber below was surprisingly spacious, its ceiling supported by stone arches that had withstood the test of time. Thomas held the torch higher, revealing walls covered in faded frescoes depicting robed figures, tending gardens and preparing medicines. Dusty shelves lined one wall, holding clay pots and glass vials long since emptied of their contents. As Blackwood and Matthew joined him, all three stood in silent awe, absorbing the weight of history surrounding them. "The monk's laboratory," Blackwood whispered, respect evident in his voice, "undisturbed for generations." Thomas moved deeper into the chamber, his torch illuminating dusty tables with ancient instruments and crumbling manuscripts. At the far end stood a stone altar of sorts, and above it a niche carved into the wall. "Look!" Matthew said, pointing to writing etched above the niche, Latin phrases that none of them could fully translate. Blackwood approached the altar, studying the inscriptions. My Latin is limited, but I recognize some phrases. Life eternal, and blessing of the afflicted. Thomas reached into the niche and withdrew a small wooden box, its surface intricately carved with the same symbol that marked the entrance stone. With trembling hands, he placed it on the altar and carefully lifted the lid. Inside lay a sealed glass vial containing a dark liquid, alongside a rolled parchment bound with a simple cord. The three exchanged glances of mingled disbelief and awe. The vitae elixir, Blackwood breathed. Crawford was right, it does exist. Thomas hesitated before touching either object. If this truly is what Crawford seeks, it's more dangerous than we realized. The power to cure any disease would make its possessor virtually untouchable, Blackwood finished. Kings would pay fortunes for such a remedy. Matthew looked between the two men. What do we do with it? Before either could answer, a new voice echoed from the chamber entrance. You hand it over, boy. Jackson Miller, Lord Crawford's steward, stood silhouetted against the morning light streaming through the opening, a loaded crossbow in his hands. Behind him, several armed men peered into the chamber. Lord Crawford will be pleased we found it so quickly. Thomas instinctively moved to shield Matthew, his mind racing. They were trapped underground with no weapons except a small knife at Blackwood's belt. How did you find us? Blackwood demanded, his voice betraying no fear despite their precarious situation. Miller's thin lips curved into a smirk. You weren't as careful as you thought. One of my men observed your little midnight adventure with the saboteurs. When he reported Thomas's mention of a stone chamber, Lord Crawford knew exactly what you'd found. He gestured with the crossbow. The box, now. Thomas made a split-second decision. Grabbing the wooden box, he thrust it behind him toward Matthew while lunging toward the torch mounted on the wall. Run! He shouted, yanking the torch free and hurling it at Miller. Chaos erupted in the confined space. Miller fired the crossbow as he dodged the flaming projectile, the bolt embedding itself in a wooden shelf instead of Thomas. Matthew clutched the box and ducked behind the altar as Blackwood seized the momentary confusion to tackle one of Miller's men entering the chamber. Thomas grabbed a heavy glass vessel from a shelf and hurled it at a second intruder, the impact sending the man stumbling backward into his companions. Matthew, the back wall, he shouted, remembering something from his childhood explorations, a narrow passage his small frame had discovered but been too afraid to explore. Matthew needed no further prompting. Clutching the precious box, he scrambled toward the chambers, feeling along the rough wall until his fingers found what his father remembered, a crack just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Without hesitation, the boy slipped into the hidden passage. Thomas engaged Miller directly, desperation lending him strength. They grappled in the semi-darkness, neither gaining a clear advantage until Blackwood, having dispatched one opponent, joined the fray. Together they managed to force Miller back toward the entrance. Go! Blackwood shouted to Thomas. Find Matthew! I'll hold them off! Thomas hesitated only briefly before racing to the back wall and forcing his broader shoulders through the narrow opening Matthew had used. Behind him he heard the sounds of the continuing struggle, Blackwood's defiant shouts and Miller's angry commands. The passage was pitch black and claustrophobically tight, forcing Thomas to move by feel alone. The rough stones scraped his shoulders as he pushed forward, calling Matthew's name in a hoarse whisper. After what seemed an eternity, he felt the passage widening and heard his son's relieved response. Pa, I'm here. Emerging into a second, smaller chamber, Thomas found Matthew waiting, the wooden box still clutched protectively to his chest. This room appeared to be a simple storage space with a narrow shaft of light penetrating from somewhere above. There's "A way out," Matthew explained, pointing upward. "A hidden exit. I think I can climb it." Thomas examined the shaft, barely wide enough for a man, with rough-hewn handholds carved into its sides. It stretched upward perhaps 15 feet to what appeared to be another sliding stone similar to the entrance they'd used. "You go first," Thomas urged. "I'll be right behind you." As Matthew began to climb, the sounds of pursuit grew louder in the passage Thomas had just navigated. Miller's men had followed, and by the sounds of it, they were closing in rapidly. "Hurry!" "Matthew!" The boy scrambled upward with surprising agility, reaching the top and pushing against the stone cover. For a heart-stopping moment, it refused to budge. But then, with a grinding sound, it shifted enough for Matthew to squeeze through to the surface. Thomas began his own ascent, his larger frame making the climb considerably more difficult. Below, he heard the first of Miller's men entering the storage chamber. "He's climbing out," someone shouted. "Shoot him!" An arrow whistled past Thomas's head as he neared the top, embedding itself in the wooden support beam inches from his face. Another grazed his leg, drawing blood. Matthew's hands appeared at the opening, reaching down to help pull his father through. With one final effort, Thomas hauled himself out of the shaft and onto the surface, collapsing beside Matthew in a field of tall grass. They had emerged nearly 100 yards from the original entrance, hidden from view by an ancient gnarled oak tree. "We made it," Matthew gasped, still clutching the wooden box. Thomas nodded grimly, catching his breath. "But Blackwood is still down there." He struggled to his feet, wincing at the arrow wound in his leg. "We need to move. They'll be coming out of that shaft any moment." Supporting each other, father and son moved quickly through the tall grass toward a small copse of trees at the field's edge. Only when they reached its shelter did Thomas pause, to examine what they had risked so much to retrieve. Opening the wooden box, he carefully removed the sealed vial and the rolled parchment. The glass was cool to the touch, its contents dark and viscous. With great care, Thomas unrolled the parchment, revealing intricate writing and diagrams, instructions for preparing and administering the elixir. "This is it," he murmured. "What Crawford is willing to kill for." "What do we do now?" Matthew asked, looking back toward the farm where men could be seen emerging from the hidden exit, spreading out in search patterns. Thomas's expression hardened. "With determination, we find Eleanor. If anyone can verify what this truly is, it's her. Then we rescue Blackwood." He carefully repacked the precious items. Crawford may have won this skirmish, but the battle isn't over. As they slipped deeper into the woods, Thomas couldn't help wondering what had become of Blackwood and what price his friend might be paying for their escape. One thing was certain. Lord Crawford now knew the elixir existed, and he would stop at nothing to possess it. The stakes had just become infinitely higher than a simple land dispute. The forest grew denser as Thomas and Matthew pushed deeper into territory few dared to enter. Local legends spoke of spirits haunting these woods, but Thomas knew the real reason people avoided them. They marked the unofficial boundary of Crawford's influence. Beyond lay disputed lands where neither Crawford's authority nor the regent's writ held absolute sway. Thomas's wounded leg made progress difficult. Blood had soaked through his makeshift bandage, and each step sent waves of pain up his thigh. Still, he pressed on, one hand clutching the precious wooden box, the other occasionally, steadying himself against Matthew's shoulder. "Are you sure Eleanor would come this far into the forest?" Matthew asked, his young voice tight with worry. Thomas nodded grimly. "She gathers rare herbs here. She once mentioned a hidden glade where she finds moonflower, a plant that only grows in soil untouched by plough or hoof." The sun had risen high overhead by the time they reached a small stream cutting through the forest floor. Thomas paused, tilting his head to listen. Just below the gentle gurgle of water, he detected the faint melody of someone humming. "This way," he whispered, leading Matthew upstream. The melody grew clearer as they approached a sunlit clearing. There, Kneeling beside a patch of blue flowers was Eleanor. Her basket was half filled with plants, and she seemed utterly absorbed in her work, unaware of their approach. "Eleanor," Thomas called softly, not wanting to startle her. She turned, sharply, relaxing only when she recognized them. Her relief quickly gave way to alarm as she noticed Thomas's blood-soaked pant leg and their haggard appearance. "What happened?" she demanded. Hurrying toward them, Thomas's strength finally gave out. He sank to his knees, the wooden box still clutched protectively against his chest. "Crawford's men," he managed. "They found the chamber. Blackwood. They took him." Eleanor's face paled. "They captured James?" While she helped Thomas to a fallen log and examined his wound, Matthew explained everything: the discovery of the underground chamber, finding the elixir, their narrow escape, and Blackwood's sacrifice. "The arrow didn't strike bone," Eleanor announced after cutting away Thomas's pant leg. "But the wound needs cleaning." She reached into her herb basket, selecting several plants with practiced hands. "This will hurt," she warned, before applying a poultice of crushed leaves to the injury. Thomas grimaced, but remained silent as she worked. Only when she had finished binding the wound with strips torn from her underskirt did he speak again. "Found it, Eleanor," he said quietly, opening the wooden box to reveal its contents. "The Vitae elixir." Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the ancient vial, holding it up to the sunlight. The liquid inside seemed to absorb, rather, than reflect the light, remaining stubbornly opaque. "All these years," she murmured. "I thought it was just a legend." Thomas handed her the parchment. "Can you read this?" None of us could decipher it completely. Eleanor carefully unrolled the brittle document, her eyes widening as she scanned its contents. "This isn't just a formula," she said after several minutes. "It's a warning." "A warning?" Matthew echoed, leaning forward to peer at the cryptic writing. Eleanor nodded slowly. "The elixir grants healing, yes, but at a cost. The monks discovered that while it could cure almost any ailment, it created a dependency." She looked up, her expression grave. "Those who took it once would eventually need to take it again, and in greater quantities." "Like a poison?" Thomas asked. "No, more like—" Eleanor searched for the right words. "More like a tether that binds the recipient to the provider." The monks realized too late that their miracle cure could become a tool of control. That's why they hid it during the purge, not to save it, but to prevent its misuse. The implications struck Thomas with the force of a physical blow. "If Crawford got his hands on this, he could control the regent completely," Eleanor finished. "And through him, perhaps even the crown." She carefully re-rolled the parchment. "Now we understand why he wants your land so desperately. It's not just about the formula, it's about power." Matthew, who had been keeping watch at the clearing's edge, suddenly tensed. "Someone's coming," he hissed. Thomas struggled to his feet, ignoring the pain shooting through his leg. Eleanor quickly returned the vial and parchment to the box, which Thomas tucked inside his tunic. They retreated to the tree line, seeking concealment among the dense underbrush. A lone figure entered the clearing, moving with the caution of someone who knew they were being watched. Thomas felt a rush of relief when he recognized Harris, the burly member of Blackwood's band, who had helped defend the farm. "It's safe," Thomas called softly, stepping back into the clearing. "Harris, what news?" The big man's normally stoic expression was troubled. "Crawford's men have taken the farm. They're tearing up the fields, searching for more chambers." He hesitated before delivering the worst news. "They've announced Blackwood will hang at dawn, a public execution in the village square." "No!" Eleanor gasped. "On what charges?" "Treason, theft of the Lord's property, inciting rebellion, the usual fabrications," Harris replied bitterly. Thomas's mind raced. How many men hold the farm? At least 15, with Crawford himself overseeing the search. Another 10 guard. Blackwood in the village jail. Harris's gaze fell on Thomas's bandaged leg. You're in no condition for a rescue attempt, if that's what you're thinking. We can't let Blackwood die, Thomas insisted. He risked everything for us. Eleanor placed a restraining hand on his arm. Rushing in would only get you killed. We need a plan. And allies. Harris nodded in agreement. The rest of our band is gathering at the old mill, 2 miles east of here, 30 men, well-armed and loyal to Blackwood. The villagers would help too, Matthew added eagerly. They stood with us before. Thomas's expression darkened. I won't risk the villagers' lives. Crawford would show no mercy if they opposed him directly. Eleanor's green eyes flashed with sudden inspiration. Perhaps we don't need to oppose him directly. There might be another way. She glanced meaningfully at the wooden box hidden in Thomas's tunic. Something that leverages what Crawford wants. Most. The elixir? Thomas asked. You want to use it as bait? Not exactly, Eleanor replied, a plan clearly forming in her mind. Crawford doesn't know we understand what the elixir truly is, or its dangers. What if we could convince him that he needs our help to use it properly? The group fell silent, considering her words. Harris broke the silence first. You're suggesting we negotiate? With Crawford. His tone made clear what he thought of such an idea. Not negotiate, Eleanor corrected. Manipulate. Crawford's ambition is his greatest weakness. If he believes the elixir requires special preparation that only I can provide, you'd put yourself in his power, Thomas objected. It's too dangerous. Eleanor's expression softened as she regarded Thomas. I've lived under Crawford's shadow for years, as we all have. Sometimes the greatest risk is doing nothing. She turned to Harris. Take us to the others. We'll need every advantage if this is to work. As dusk fell, the old mill came alive with activity. Blackwood's band gathered in the cavernous main floor, their faces illuminated by scattered lanterns. The mood was grim. These were men who had already lost much to Crawford's greed and now faced losing their leader as well. Thomas stood before them, leaning on a staff to keep weight off his injured leg. Despite his exhaustion and pain, his voice rang out clear and determined as he explained their plan. Some voices raised objections, but most nodded in silent agreement as the strategy took shape. Crawford expects us to attempt a direct rescue, Thomas concluded. He'll have reinforced the jail, positioned extra guards. We won't give him what he expects. Instead, Eleanor continued, stepping forward, we offer him what he truly wants, the elixir, but on our terms. I'll approach him as a healer, claiming I alone understand how to prepare the formula. Meanwhile, Harris added, our main force will position here and here. He indicated points on a rough map spread before them. Not to attack, but to be ready. When the signal comes, Matthew, who had been quietly observing, suddenly spoke up. What about the farm, our home? A painful silence followed his question. Thomas placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Homes can be rebuilt, Matthew. What matters now are the people we care about. As night deepened, final preparations were made. Thomas took Eleanor aside, concern evident in his features. If something goes wrong, if Crawford suspects anything, he won't, she assured him, though uncertainty flickered briefly in her eyes. His arrogance blinds him. He'll believe I've chosen the winning side out of self-preservation. Thomas hesitated, then reached inside his tunic and removed a simple necklace, a wooden pendant carved with the initials S.H. This was Sarah's, he said quietly. She always said it brought her luck. He pressed it into Eleanor's palm. For tomorrow. Eleanor closed her fingers around the pendant, understanding the significance of such a gesture. I'll return it to you when this is over, she promised. As the others settled in for a few hours of rest before dawn, Thomas found himself unable to sleep. He sat outside the mill, gazing up at stars, partially obscured by drifting clouds. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily upon him, for Matthew, for Blackwood, For everyone who had stood with him against Crawford, whatever tomorrow brought, he knew nothing would be the same again. The simple life he had cherished was already slipping away, replaced by a dangerous game of power and deception. Yet something new had awakened within him as well, a determination that went beyond mere survival or protecting his property. For the first time since Sarah's death, he felt truly alive, fighting for something larger than himself. The wooden box rested in his lap, its ancient contents both a blessing and a curse. Thomas wondered what the monks who had hidden it would think of their creation being used in such a manner. Would they approve of the risk Eleanor was about to take? Or would they counsel destroying the elixir forever, removing its temptation from the world? "Pa?" Matthew's voice came softly as the boy settled beside him. "Do you think we'll ever go home again?" Thomas put his arm around his son's shoulders. "I don't know," he answered honestly, "but whatever happens, we'll face it together." As father and son shared this moment of quiet understanding miles away in the village jail, James Blackwood stood at the barred window of his cell, gazing at the same stars. His face bore the marks of interrogation, but his spirit remained unbroken. Like Thomas, he sensed the approaching dawn would bring either salvation or doom, and like Thomas, he was prepared to face either with dignity. Dawn broke with ominous, grey clouds gathering on the horizon, promising rain by midday. In the village square of Oakridge, Crawford's men had already erected a gallows. The crude wooden structure stood as a stark warning: defy Lord Crawford, and this would be your fate. Villagers peered fearfully from windows and doorways, none daring to venture into the open square where armed guards patrolled. Inside the village jail, a small stone building adjacent to the magistrate's office, James Blackwood sat with his back against the damp wall. Despite the bruises on his face and the chains binding his wrists, his expression remained composed, almost serene. The guard watching him shifted uncomfortably under Blackwood's steady gaze. "You should be begging for mercy," the guard finally muttered, breaking the silence. Blackwood's lips curved in a faint smile. Would it make any difference? The guard had no answer for that. Outside the village, in the cold light of early morning, Eleanor Davis approached the main road alone. She had exchanged her usual simple dress for her best clothes, a dark green gown with embroidered sleeves, the attire she reserved for festivals and important occasions. Around her neck hung Thomas's pendant, concealed beneath her collar. In her hands, she carried a small wooden case containing herbs and remedies, the tools of her healing trade. When Crawford's sentries spotted her, they immediately raised their weapons. "Halt!" one called out. "State your business." Eleanor remained calm, her voice clear and steady. "I am Eleanor Davis, the village healer. I seek audience with Lord Crawford on a matter of great importance." The sentries exchanged uncertain glances. One departed to relay the message, while the other kept Eleanor under watch, his crossbow trained on her heart. Minutes stretched into nearly an hour before the messenger returned. "Lord Crawford will see you," he announced, his tone suggesting surprise at this development. "You'll be escorted to the Harrow farm." A small contingent of mounted guards surrounded Eleanor as they made their way through the village and out to Thomas's land. The farm was barely recognizable. What had been meticulously tended fields were now scarred with trenches and holes, as Crawford's men systematically tore apart the soil, searching for additional hidden chambers. The barn doors hung broken on their hinges, and even the modest farmhouse had been partially dismantled, its contents strewn across the yard. At the center of this destruction stood Lord Crawford, directing the efforts from atop his black stallion. He turned as Eleanor was brought before him, his cold eyes assessing her with calculating interest. "The village witch," he remarked, his tone deliberately insulting. "To what do I owe this unexpected visit?" Eleanor did not rise to the bait. I come to offer my services, my lord. I understand you've discovered something of great value here, something that requires a healer's knowledge to properly utilize. Crawford's expression hardened. What do you know of what we've found? I know the legends of Silverstone Priory, Eleanor replied carefully. I know the monks created a remarkable elixir before they were destroyed. And I know that Thomas Harrow and his son escaped with a sample of that elixir yesterday. Crawford dismounted, approaching Eleanor with narrowed eyes. And how would you know such specific details unless you've spoken with Harrow? Because I am a healer, Eleanor answered simply. Such knowledge is passed down through generations of my kind. The Vitae elixir is not merely a legend to those of us who study the healing arts. Crawford studied her face, searching for deception. If what you say is true, what brings you to me rather than aiding your friends? Eleanor met his gaze unflinchingly. Self-preservation, my lord. I've seen what happens to those who oppose you. More importantly, I understand what the elixir truly is and what it requires. Explain, Crawford demanded. The elixir is potent but incomplete in its current form, Eleanor said, the lie flowing smoothly from her lips. It must be properly prepared before use, with additional ingredients and specific rituals that only a trained healer would know. Without these preparations, it's worthless, or worse, potentially deadly. Crawford's expression revealed his uncertainty. This was information he hadn't anticipated, a complication in his carefully constructed plan. And you possess this knowledge? He asked, suspicion still evident in his voice. Eleanor nodded. I do. Which is why I've come to offer my expertise in exchange for certain considerations. You're hardly in a position to bargain, Crawford scoffed, gesturing to the armed men surrounding them. On the contrary, Eleanor replied calmly, without me, the elixir you seek is merely colored water. With my help, it becomes the miracle you can present to the regent. I think that puts me in a unique position. A tense silence fell as Crawford considered her words. Jackson Miller approached, whispering urgently in his lord's ear, but Crawford waved him away. What are these considerations you seek? He finally asked. James Blackwood's life, Eleanor stated firmly. Exile him if you must, but the hanging must not proceed. Second, Thomas Harrow and his son must be granted safe passage to leave the county with enough funds to establish themselves elsewhere. Third, the village of Oakridge must be protected from retaliation. Crawford laughed coldly. You demand much for someone surrounded by my knights. I offer much, Eleanor countered. The regent's gratitude would be substantial for the one who presents him with a cure for his affliction. The mention of the regent's illness, a closely guarded secret, caused Crawford to reassess the healer before him. Perhaps she did indeed possess the knowledge she claimed, and Harrow would willingly surrender the elixir under these terms. Crawford asked skeptically. He would, Eleanor confirmed. He values his son's safety above all else. I can arrange the exchange tonight. After a long moment of calculation, Crawford nodded. Very well. Blackwood's execution will be postponed, not cancelled. Arrange for Harrow to bring the elixir to the old stone bridge at sunset. If all proceeds as you claim, your terms will be met. I'll need proof that Blackwood still lives, Eleanor insisted. Crawford motioned to Miller. Take her to the village. Show her the prisoner is alive, then escort her wherever she needs to go to contact Harrow. As Eleanor was led away, Crawford turned to one of his captains. Double the guard at the jail. Position archers on the surrounding rooftops. If this is a trap, I want every approach covered. The captain nodded and departed to carry out his orders. Miller, escorting Eleanor toward the village, could not contain his curiosity. Lord Crawford is being uncommonly accommodating, he observed. What makes you so confident he'll honor these terms once he has the elixir? Eleanor's smile didn't reach her eyes. I didn't say I was confident, Master Miller. I simply said those were my terms. In the village jail, Eleanor was permitted a brief visit with Blackwood. The former knight looked up as she entered his cell, surprise momentarily breaking through his composed expression. "Why are you here?" he asked quietly. Aware of the guard watching from the doorway, Eleanor knelt beside him, ostensibly checking his injuries. Touching the side of his face, she whispered, "We have a plan. Be ready when darkness falls." Aloud, she announced, "These wounds need treatment. I'll need to prepare a poultice." The guard shifted impatiently. "Make it quick. You've seen he's alive as promised." After administering basic care to Blackwood's most visible injuries, Eleanor was escorted out of the jail. "I must gather certain herbs," she told Miller. "I require privacy for the preparations, and to contact Harrow." Miller looked skeptical, but ultimately nodded. "You have until midday. I'll return for you then." Once alone in her small cottage at the village edge, Eleanor worked quickly. She gathered specific herbs and powders, creating several small packets. One she slipped into her boot, another into a hidden pocket of her dress. Then she penned a brief message, attaching it to the leg of a carrier pigeon kept specifically for urgent communications with outlying settlements. As the bird winged away, she whispered, "Fly swift, little one." Miles away, Thomas received her. Message at the old mill. His face grew grim as he read her words. "Crawford has agreed to the meeting," he informed the gathered men. "Eleanor has seen Blackwood. He lives, though he's been mistreated." Harris studied the crude map they had drawn in the dirt floor. "The stone bridge is easily defended. Crawford will have men positioned here, and likely archers on these ridges." He indicated the strategic points. "It's a perfect spot for an ambush, which is precisely why we won't be fighting there," Thomas replied. "The bridge meeting is a diversion. While Crawford's attention is fixed on acquiring the elixir, our main force will move on the village jail." Matthew, who had insisted on being included in the planning, spoke up. "But what about Eleanor? She'll be in danger if Crawford realizes he's been tricked." Thomas's expression revealed his own concern. "Eleanor knows the risk. She's prepared. Something for her own protection." He turned to the gathered men. "We move in 3 groups. Harris will lead the largest force through the eastern forest to approach the jail from behind. Jacob takes 10 men to create a diversion at the mill road. I'll go to the bridge with a small group to meet Crawford." "With your injured leg?" Harris objected. "You can barely walk." "Crawford will expect me," Thomas insisted, "and I'll have something he wants." He patted the wooden box containing the elixir. As preparations continued, Matthew cornered his father outside the mill. "I should go with you to the bridge." Thomas shook his head firmly. "No, you'll remain with Harris. If anything happens to me..." "Nothing will happen to you," Matthew interrupted, his young voice cracking with emotion. "We've lost our farm. I can't lose you too." Thomas pulled his son into a fierce embrace. "You won't lose me, but this is the only way to save Blackwood and ensure our future, whatever that might hold." He pulled back, looking into eyes so like his late wife's. "Your mother would be proud of the man you're becoming, Matthew. I need you to be strong for just a little longer." As the day wore on, storm clouds continued to gather. By mid-afternoon, the first raindrops began to fall, a steady drizzle that promised to become a downpour by evening. Thomas gazed at the darkening sky, knowing the weather could either help or hinder their plans. "A good day for new beginnings," he murmured, remembering how Sarah had always claimed rain on planting day promised a bountiful harvest. Whether this day's rain would bring similar fortune remained to be seen. With sunset approaching, the separate groups prepared to depart for their assigned positions. Thomas checked the wooden box one final time, ensuring its precious contents were secure. The ancient vial gleamed dully in the fading light, its dark liquid seemingly absorbing the shadows around it. "It's time," he announced, closing the box with a decisive click. The future of everyone he cared about now hinged on the success of their desperate gambit, and on Eleanor's ability to maintain her deception in the heart of enemy territory. The old stone bridge arched over the River Western like the backbone of some ancient beast, its weathered surface slick with rain. Dusk had given way to night, the storm clouds blotting out any light from moon or stars. Only the occasional flash of lightning illuminated the scene in brief, stark clarity. Thomas approached from the northern end, his small contingent of 5 men spread out behind him. His injured leg throbbed with each step, but he forced himself to walk without limping. Any sign of weakness now could be fatal. Despite the pouring rain, he kept the wooden box visible in his hands, a clear signal to the watchers he knew were hidden among the trees on both sides of the bridge. On the southern bank, torches flickered as Lord Crawford's party emerged from the shadows. Thomas counted at least 12 men, with Crawford himself mounted on his black stallion at their centre. Eleanor stood among them, a hooded cloak concealing most of her face from Thomas's view. He searched for any sign that she had been mistreated, but the distance and darkness made it impossible to be certain. Crawford urged his horse forward onto the bridge, stopping at its midpoint. His voice carried over the sound of rain and rushing water below. "That's far enough, Harrow. Come forward." Alone with the elixir, Thomas turned to the men behind him. "Remember, no matter what happens, hold your positions until you hear the signal from the village." With that final instruction, he continued alone, the wooden box clutched firmly in his hands. The rain plastered his hair to his forehead and ran in rivulets down his face as he made his way to the center of the bridge. "Lord Crawford," he greeted coldly when they stood face to face. Crawford's gaze fixed immediately on the box. "I see you've come to your senses. A wise decision. I came for Blackwood's life and my son's future," Thomas replied. "Nothing more." Crawford smiled thinly. "Your healer friend has explained your terms. Most generous of me to consider them. Wouldn't you agree?" Thomas glanced at Eleanor, trying to read her expression beneath the hood. She gave an almost imperceptible nod. "Show me proof that Blackwood lives," Thomas demanded, turning back to Crawford. Crawford made a gesture, and one of his men stepped forward, extending a sealed parchment. "The magistrate's stay of execution signed this afternoon. Your friend will remain in custody, but unharmed, provided our business concludes satisfactorily." Thomas accepted the document, examining it briefly before tucking it inside his sodden tunic. "And my son's passage. 20 silver pieces and safe conduct to the border of Westford County," Crawford confirmed. "Again, contingent on the elixir's authenticity." Thomas's hands tightened on the wooden box. "The healer has explained the preparation requirements?" "She has," Crawford replied, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Now, the elixir, if you please. This weather grows tiresome." For a moment Thomas hesitated. Everything depended on timing. Now, Eleanor's safety, Blackwood's rescue, Matthew's future. The rain continued to pound around them, and in the distance, thunder rumbled ominously. "First," Thomas said, "allow the healer to approach. She must verify the contents remain undamaged by our journey." Crawford's eyes narrowed suspiciously, but after a moment he nodded to Eleanor. She moved forward, her steps carefully measured, until she stood between the 2 men. "Open it," Crawford commanded. Thomas lifted the lid, revealing the ancient vial nestled within. In the dim light, the dark liquid seemed to swirl of its own accord, as if alive. Eleanor leaned closer, examining it with a healer's critical eye. "It appears intact," she announced, her voice carrying a hidden message for Thomas alone. All was proceeding as planned. "Excellent," Crawford declared, reaching for the box. "Our business is concluded." Thomas pulled back slightly. "The document of safe passage for my son, as agreed." Crawford sighed with exaggerated patience. "Miller, the document." Jackson Miller approached, producing a sealed parchment from inside his tunic. He handed it to Thomas, who examined it carefully before tucking it away with the stay of execution. "Satisfied?" Crawford asked, sarcasm dripping from his voice. Thomas took a deep breath and handed the wooden box to Crawford. "Remember our agreement. Blackwood lives, my son goes free, and the village remains unharmed." Crawford clutched the box possessively, a gleam of triumph in his eyes. Of course, I am a man of my word." He turned to Eleanor. "Now, Healer, you will accompany me to prepare this properly for the regent." Eleanor nodded, but as she turned to follow Crawford, her hand slipped inside her cloak. Thomas saw the brief movement and tensed. "Ready?" "Actually," Eleanor said calmly, "there's something you should know about the elixir, Lord Crawford." Crawford paused, looking back with irritation. "What is it now?" "The monks who created it were clever men," she continued, her voice steady despite the danger. "They anticipated that powerful men might seek to use it for control rather than healing." Crawford's expression darkened. "Get to the point, woman!" In one swift motion, Eleanor withdrew a small vial from beneath her cloak and held it up. "They ensured only those with pure intentions could unleash its power. Without this counter-agent, what you hold is quite poisonous." "What trickery is this?" Crawford snarled, his hand moving to his sword hilt. Before he could draw, a massive explosion rocked the night, not from the storm, but from the direction of the village. All heads turned toward the distant flare of light and the sound of shouting that followed. "That would be the signal," Thomas said quietly. Crawford's face contorted with rage as understanding dawned. "Guards, seize them both!" But Eleanor had already thrown the small vial at Crawford's feet. It shattered, releasing a cloud of fine powder that the rain quickly transformed into a clinging mist. Crawford and his nearby men began coughing violently, their eyes watering as the irritant took effect. Thomas grabbed Eleanor's arm, pulling her back toward the northern end of the bridge, where his men waited. "Run!" he shouted as Crawford's archers, positioned further back and unaffected by Eleanor's powder, began to take aim. Arrows whistled through the rain-filled air as Thomas and Eleanor fled. One grazed Thomas's shoulder, another struck the stone by Eleanor's foot. Behind them, Crawford's enraged shouts competed with the thunder. Kill them both." Thomas's men rushed forward, providing covering fire with their own bows, as Thomas and Eleanor reached the relative safety of the northern bank. Without pausing, the entire group plunged into the forest, using the darkness and rain as cover for their escape. "Did it work?" Thomas gasped as they ran, his injured leg threatening to buckle with each step. Eleanor nodded, breathless from their flight. "The powder will keep them disoriented for several minutes, and Crawford still believes he needs me to prepare the elixir properly." "Then we've bought the time needed," Thomas said grimly. "Now everything depends on Harris and the others." In the village of Oakridge, chaos reigned. The diversion Jacob had created, setting fire to an abandoned storehouse near the village square, had drawn most of Crawford's guards away from the jail. Harris and his force had struck swiftly from behind, overwhelming the remaining guards. Before they could raise an alarm, Blackwood, hearing the commotion, had positioned himself near the cell door. When Harris and two others burst in, he was ready. "Took you long enough," he remarked dryly as Harris broke the lock. "Had to wait for the weather to turn properly dramatic," Harris replied with a grin, handing Blackwood a sword. "Seemed fitting for a rescue." Blackwood tested the weapon's weight, nodding with satisfaction. "How many men do we have?" 20 here. 5 with Thomas at the bridge distracting Crawford," Harris reported as they moved swiftly through the jail. "The village is ours for the moment, but not for long once Crawford realizes he's been duped." Outside, the rain continued to pour as Blackwood emerged into freedom. The village square was illuminated by the burning storehouse, its flames somehow persisting despite the downpour. Villagers had emerged from their homes, some helping to contain the fire, others watching in confused fascination as Blackwood's Men secured the area. We need to move quickly, Blackwood ordered. Gather everyone at the church. It's the most defensible building. As his men carried out these instructions, Blackwood turned to Matthew, who had insisted on joining the rescue party despite Thomas's objections. Your father, Eleanor. At the bridge with Crawford, Matthew replied, worry evident in his young voice. They should be on their way back by now if all went as planned. Blackwood's expression grew grave. Crawford won't take deception lightly. Once he realizes what's happened, his rage will be terrible. Inside the village church, villagers gathered in growing numbers, their expressions a mixture of fear and determination. Mason the blacksmith distributed what weapons they had, mostly farming implements and tools hastily repurposed. Women prepared bandages from torn clothing, while children were ushered to the relative safety of the cellar beneath the altar. What happens now? Old Jenkins asked, his butcher's cleaver clutched in gnarled hands. Crawford will bring his full force against us when he returns. We hold, Blackwood replied simply. We've taken his prisoner and his leverage. He'll have to negotiate. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the gathered villagers. Negotiate with Crawford? The concept seemed foreign to those who had lived under his oppression for so long. The church doors burst open, admitting Thomas, Eleanor, and their small group, all soaked to the skin and bearing the marks of their narrow escape. A cheer went up at their appearance, quickly hushed by Blackwood's raised hand. Crawford? He asked without preamble. Furious, Thomas replied grimly, accepting a blanket from a concerned villager. And in possession of the elixir, though Eleanor convinced him it's useless without her expertise. Which buys us time but not safety, Eleanor added, wringing water from her hair. He'll return with greater numbers, and his pride won't allow him to leave empty-handed. Thomas's eyes found Matthew across the crowded church, relief washing over his features as he confirmed his son was unharmed. The boy rushed to his father's side, embracing him fiercely. Did you give him the real elixir? Matthew whispered. Thomas nodded solemnly. We had to. But without Eleanor's supposed counter-agent, he'll hesitate to use it. Blackwood gathered the leaders in the small vestry adjacent to the main church. Over a hastily drawn map of the village, they plotted their defense. The church, situated on a small rise in the center of Oak Ridge, provided good visibility in all directions. Its stone walls and single entrance made it naturally defensible. We have perhaps an hour before Crawford regroups and returns, Blackwood estimated. Every available hand must help fortify our position. As the others departed to oversee preparations, Thomas lingered with Eleanor and Blackwood. There's something I haven't told you, he said quietly. About the elixir. Both turned to him with questioning gazes. I switched vials before meeting. Crawford, Thomas revealed. What he has is colored water, nothing more. The real elixir and formula are hidden back at the farm, in a place only Matthew and I know. Eleanor's eyes widened. Thomas, Crawford will kill me when he discovers the deception. He won't discover it, Thomas insisted. Not tonight, at least. And by morning, we'll have implemented the second part of our plan. He turned to Blackwood. That's why I need you to get a message to the regent. Immediately. The night seemed eternal as rain continued to pour from the heavens, transforming the village streets into muddy rivers. Inside the church, villagers had barricaded the entrance with pews and anything else they could move, while archers positioned themselves at the narrow windows. Children huddled in the cellar below, comforted by the older women who told stories to mask the sounds of preparation above. Thomas stood with Blackwood near the altar, where a single candle illuminated a hastily written message. Richardson is our only hope, Thomas explained, referring to the young messenger selected for the desperate mission. He knows the forest paths better than anyone. If anyone can reach the regent before Crawford's men intercept him, it's Richardson. Blackwood studied the message one final time before rolling and sealing it. You're staking everything on the regent's honor, a quality not abundant in nobles these days. Not his honor, Thomas corrected, his self-interest. Crawford has grown too powerful, too quickly. The regent might welcome an excuse to check that power. Richardson, a lean man with the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life in the forest, approached. The eastern path is still clear, he reported. I can be halfway to the regent's summer palace by dawn if I leave now. Thomas placed a hand on the messenger's shoulder. This isn't just about our village or my land. That elixir in the wrong hands could shift the balance of power throughout the realm. Richardson nodded grimly, tucking the sealed message into an oilskin pouch beneath his tunic. I won't fail. With that, he slipped out through a small side door, disappearing into the storm-lashed night. Eleanor joined them, her face etched with concern. Crawford will be less than pleased when he discovers the elixir is merely colored water. We're staking our lives on Richardson's speed and the regent's goodwill. We're staking our lives on our own courage, Blackwood replied firmly. The message is merely insurance. A sudden commotion at the front of the church drew their attention. One of the lookouts rushed in, water streaming from his cloak, riders approaching. At least 30 men, torches lit despite the rain. Thomas, Blackwood, and Eleanor moved quickly to the front, peering through a narrow window. Through sheets of rain, they could see the flickering glow of torches moving steadily toward the village from the direction of the bridge. Crawford wastes no time, Blackwood observed grimly. He must have summoned reinforcements from his estate. Is everyone in position? Thomas asked, scanning the church where villagers and Blackwood's men waited tensely. Harris nodded from his position near the barricaded door. Archers at every window, swordsmen ready if they breach the entrance. Thomas turned to Matthew, who stood nearby, clutching a short hunting bow. You should be in the cellar with the others. The boy's jaw set stubbornly. My place is here. You taught me to stand my ground. Before Thomas could argue, a booming voice cut through the storm outside. Harrow! Blackwood! I know you're in there! Lord Crawford had arrived, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of a man whose pride had been wounded deeply. Blackwood moved to a window, positioning himself where he could be seen while remaining protected. Crawford! He called back. Have you come to negotiate the release of your men? They had captured 4 of Crawford's guards during the jailbreak and now held them in the church vestry. Negotiate. Crawford's laugh held no humor. I've come to burn this church to the ground unless you surrender immediately. Both the elixir and the healer belong to me. The elixir is worthless without proper preparation, Blackwood replied, and the healer remains here of her own free will. Crawford's response was immediate and chilling. Then you've sealed your fate. I've brought enough men to end this rebellion tonight. Look around you. Torches flared in a wide circle around the church as more of Crawford's men emerged from the darkness. They were surrounded, outnumbered at least 3 to 1. Thomas joined Blackwood at the window. We've bought Richardson almost 2 hours. Even if we fall, the regent will know the truth before sunrise. Crawford's patience had clearly reached its end. You have until I count to 20 to surrender the healer and the real elixir. After that, we attack, and I promise no mercy will be shown. The villagers exchanged fearful glances as Crawford began his count. Thomas moved throughout the church, offering words of encouragement, his calm presence steadying those whose resolve wavered. 15, 16. Crawford's counting continued inexorably. Eleanor approached Thomas, her expression resolute. I should surrender myself. There's no need for everyone to die protecting me. No one is surrendering, Thomas said firmly. Crawford won't stop with you. He wants the elixir, and he wants revenge for the humiliation we've caused him. 19, 20. Crawford's voice reached its crescendo. Men, advance! The first volley of arrows struck the church windows, forcing the defenders to duck for cover. Outside, Crawford's men rushed forward with a battering ram improvised from a fallen tree. "Archers, return fire!" Blackwood commanded. The church defenders loosed their arrows through the windows, striking several of Crawford's advancing men. But the attackers kept coming, the battering ram slamming into the barricaded door with a thunderous crash that shook the entire building. Thomas positioned himself with a group of defenders near the entrance, sword in hand. "When the door breaks, fall back to the altar step by step. Make them fight for every inch." The battering ram struck again, splintering the ancient wood. A third blow shattered the barricade, and Crawford's men poured through the breach like a tide of steel and fury. The church erupted in chaos as defender and attacker clashed in the narrow confines. Thomas found himself face to face with Jackson Miller, Crawford's steward. The thin man was surprisingly skilled with a blade, forcing Thomas to give ground despite his determined defense. Thomas's injured leg nearly betrayed him as he parried a vicious thrust, the movement sending pain shooting up his thigh. Across the church, Blackwood fought like a man possessed, his years of knightly training evident in every movement as he held back 3 attackers single-handedly. Eleanor had positioned herself near the altar, using her knowledge of herbs to treat the wounded who were dragged to safety. Matthew, despite his youth, proved himself his father's son. When one of Crawford's men broke through the defensive line, heading straight for Eleanor, the boy loosed an arrow that struck the attacker's shoulder, giving Harris time to intercept and subdue him. But for every attacker they repelled, more seemed to pour through the shattered door. Thomas knew they couldn't hold out much longer. Their hope now rested entirely with Richardson and his desperate ride through the storm. As dawn approached, the fighting reached a fevered pitch. The defenders had been pushed back to the altar steps, forming a last semicircle of resistance. Crawford himself now stood in the church doorway, surveying the scene with cold satisfaction. "Surrender now," he called, "and some may be spared." Before anyone could respond, a new sound cut through the din of battle. A horn, clear and commanding, repeated 3 times. The fighting momentarily paused as all turned toward the sound. "The Regent's herald," Blackwood breathed, disbelief and hope mingling in his voice. Through the broken door, they could see riders approaching. Not Crawford's men, but soldiers bearing the Regent's standard, their armor gleaming despite the rain. At their head rode a figure Thomas recognized from his single visit to court years. Before, Robert Fletcher, the Regent himself, flanked by his personal guard, Crawford's face drained of color. He turned to his men. "Hold! Hold your positions!" The Regent dismounted before the church, his expression stern as he surveyed the scene. Richardson stood nearby, clearly having completed his desperate mission successfully. "Lord Crawford," the Regent called, his voice cutting through the pre-dawn light. "I received a most disturbing message concerning your activities. It appears I arrived just in time to witness them firsthand." Crawford dropped to one knee, his arrogance replaced by obsequious humility. "My Lord Regent, I was merely putting down a rebellion." "Silence!" the Regent thundered. "I see a church desecrated, villagers attacked and blood spilled, all over a farmer's refusal to sell his legally chartered land." He turned to Thomas. "Are you Thomas Harrow?" Thomas stepped forward, bowing despite his injured leg. "I am, my lord. I understand you possess something of great interest, a monk's elixir with remarkable healing properties." Thomas nodded. "I do, my lord, hidden safely away from those who would misuse it." The Regent's gaze returned to Crawford, who seemed to shrink under the scrutiny. "And you, Crawford, sought to obtain this elixir by force? To what end?" Crawford stammered. For the good of the realm, my lord, for your own health, and—" "My health is not your concern," the Regent cut in coldly, "nor does it justify the methods I've witnessed here." He gestured to his captain, placed Lord Crawford under arrest, pending a full investigation of his actions. His estates will be held in trust until matters are settled. As Crawford was led away, protesting futilely, the Regent approached Thomas, Blackwood, and Eleanor. I would speak with the three of you privately about this elixir. Its existence raises complicated questions. In the regent's temporary quarters, established in the magistrate's office, Thomas produced the real vial and parchment, retrieved from their hiding place in the old oak tree near his farm. The monks left explicit warnings, Eleanor explained, translating portions of the ancient text. The elixir creates dependency by design, a way to ensure patients remained under the monastery's care. In the wrong hands, it becomes a tool of control rather than healing. The regent studied the dark liquid thoughtfully. A terrible power. No wonder Crawford sought it so desperately. He looked up at Thomas. What would you have done with it? Had Crawford not coveted your land? Left it buried, Thomas answered honestly. Some knowledge is too dangerous for any man to possess. The regent nodded slowly. I agree. To their surprise, he carefully returned the vial and parchment to the wooden box and handed it back to Thomas. I entrust this to your keeping, not as a possession, but as a stewardship. Hide it away again, somewhere even I cannot find it. As morning fully broke, the storm finally abated. Sunlight streamed through breaks in the clouds, illuminating a village damaged but standing. Villagers emerged from the church to assess the aftermath and begin repairs. Thomas stood on the steps, watching as Crawford's remaining men departed under the regent's guard. Eleanor tended to the wounded nearby, while Blackwood directed the clearing of debris from the village square. Matthew joined his father, his young face bearing a new maturity born of the night's events. What happens now, Pa? The farm is still in ruins. Thomas placed an arm around his son's shoulders. We rebuild. The regent has confirmed our charter and granted funds for restoration. He gazed toward the distant fields where their home had stood. It won't be easy, but we've faced worse and survived. Eleanor approached, wiping her hands on a cloth. The last patient is stable. We were fortunate. Many wounds, but no lives. Lost among our people. Thanks to you, Thomas said quietly. The unspoken connection between them had only strengthened through their shared ordeal. Blackwood joined them, his normally stern face breaking into a rare smile. The regent has offered me reinstatement of my lands and title. It seems Crawford's downfall has created opportunities for justice to be restored. Will you accept? Thomas asked. Blackwood looked thoughtful. Perhaps, though I've grown accustomed to the freedom of the forest. He clasped Thomas's shoulder. But first, we rebuild your farm. My men and I will stay until the work is done. As the four of them gazed out over the village, beginning to recover in the morning light, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death, a sense of possibility, of future not merely endured, but embraced. The land that had been his family's legacy would continue, not just as soil and crops, but as the foundation for something new. We stood our ground, he said softly, and found something worth more than land. Family, Matthew suggested. Courage, added Blackwood. Eleanor's hand found Thomas's, her fingers intertwining with his. Home, she said simply, wherever and whatever that may be. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the fields that had witnessed so much in such a short time, Thomas knew that while the story of one farmer's defiance against a lord's knights had reached its conclusion, a new chapter was just beginning, one written not in confrontation, but in reconstruction, healing, and hope. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.